Hi everyone. In this lesson, we're going to sketch out some ideas for how to 3D print a clock face for an existing clock kit. You can get kits like this at most craft stores, and they consist of a little rectangle, rounded corners, and on the back side they have a space for your AA battery, and usually somewhere a little wheel for turning the actual clock to set it. On the other side, you can see a stem sticking out of the center with threads on it and some smaller bits coming up. So looking at that from the side, it would look like alright, we have this little cylinder, it's got threads on it, and then we have some smaller plastic cylinders sticking out of the top. The individual plastic cylinders are going to rotate, and it's going to come with some kind of metal clock arms that have holes in them that will allow you to fit them onto these little rotating plastic bits to turn. What the kit doesn't have is any kind of face with numbers. So let's design a 3D print that will go around the outside of our kit. I'm going to make a simple clock face that has the numbers, so I know I'm going to need a circular shape and that we're going to put our numbers. And on the back side of our circle, we're going to need a space for this and a hole that goes all the way through so that this stem can poke through so we can attach our clock arms. After we've got a face and a hole for it, we probably want something to keep this from rotating, because if it turns, it'll make our clock no longer tell the correct time. And we'll want a way for the clock to either hang or stand. So I'll design some little feet for the clock so it can stand up, and maybe on the back side of our clock we'll have a box around our little clock motor. We can have our feet coming off of it so that it will stand up, or we can put a tube on here so we can hang it from a nail. And all of this would be really difficult to print standing up, so I think we'll design it so that the numbers in the face are cut into the surface, not sticking up, and we can print it lying down with the front side on the platform. So we'll have our entire shape here printed basically face down on the platform like so. All of the raised up details for the back are going to be standing straight up, so we won't need to add a ton of supports to it. Next, we'll go through the design of our clock kit and even some arms, custom arms for it. We are going to design this clock face here so that we can use it with an existing kit. All right, and we're going to print some replacements for the arms that come with the kit. So let's take a look at how this was put together. Ungroup it for a second here. And let's go ahead and take a look at our central hole shape here. So we've got this box here with our cylinder sticking out of it, and it represents the actual shape of the clock kit itself. So after measuring the box there, it's 55 by 55. And if I ungroup this, you can see that we have our cylinder, and our box here is 16 millimeters tall. Now, even though I created this as a hole, I'm not going to cut a hole out that is the exact dimensions of our clock kit box. We just needed to make sure that the outside of this is big enough that we can fit it in here. We don't need it to fit perfectly snug. If we make it too close to the exact measurements of this, we might find that it's very hard to get this part in there. But we do need this hole to be exactly the right size to fit the stem that the clock arms go onto. And so we have to measure that for this. And it was 8 millimeters across at the widest section. And if you've got one of these with you, then you'll see that it has a wider metal part with threads on it so that you can screw a little nut on there to keep it in place, and plastic parts that come out at 3 different levels that are the width to stick our 3 different clock face arms on. Now we're going to use measurements of those 3 individual levels, and most of them are pretty standard, but you'll probably want to measure your own just to make sure if you're doing this from a kit that you have. So let's grab our duplicate of our hole here so that I don't have to make that again. And we'll go ahead and group this guy and get him out of the way so we can start again from scratch. All right. The first thing that we're going to need is a box around this surface. And while we could use a box and another box to cut a hole into it to make this outer area, I want to try out a shape from our shape generators here. And if we go down to featured shape generators, there is a shape that's just called soft box. So if I drag this out here, it looks like the tube shape, but with a square and rounded corners instead of a cylinder. So I can go ahead and, using the dimensions of this, I know that it has to fit inside of it a 55 millimeter box. So let's take a look at this. It has X, Y, and Z dimensions, and it has a wall thickness. I think the 3 millimeter wall thickness is good. It'll be sturdy. So I want the X and Y dimensions to be greater than 55, but not very huge. So we'll try putting them at 60 and see what that's like. So now that we have this 60 by 60 box, I'll go ahead and use the Align tool, select both of these, and center them. And we can see that my box is actually too small. There's shading here that indicates that the hole is overlapping it. The reason is, of course, that the thickness of this is 3 millimeters, and that means we're losing 6 millimeters per side, 3 on each side. So I need this to be at least 6 millimeters bigger than 55. So I'll just go up to 65 in both of these directions. And now, if I grab both of them and center them, we can see that our box fits just inside with a little bit of space. If we turn flat view on, it'll be easier to see how it lines up from above. You can see that we have a millimeter or two of space, which is great. The next thing that we're going to need to do is put the actual face of the clock on the top of this. So let's go back to our basic shapes and grab a cylinder. Now, if I was to place the cylinder here, I will need to raise it up and make sure that it is sitting directly on top of my hole, and it's a little bit fiddly. So instead of doing that, I'm going to go over here to work plane, and I'm going to grab this shape and put it on top of my hole here. Might be a little bit hard to see, but the new orange work plane is lined up exactly with the top of this shape. So now any new object I put in goes onto the new work plane as if it were the floor. So it's automatically lined up with the top of this hole, which is exactly what I want. So let's crank up the sides so our shape is smooth. Let's make this also 3 millimeters thick. And let's go ahead and hold Shift while we stretch it out. That's going to become too thick, but that's okay. Since I held Shift when I grabbed the corner, it's going to scale all 3 directions the same amount, which is going to make it taller as well. I'm just going to go here after the fact and change this back to 3. All right. So now we've got our soft box here sticking out of the top, which is not the best. So I'm going to click on the box there and we'll shrink it down so it is overlapping but not sticking out of the surface of our top circle. Now we're going to grab everything once more and center it. So with the align tool, I'm going to center it in both directions. And I think the size of this clock face looks pretty good. Let's see for sure if it's a good size. Since I just dragged it up, it's 115, which will fit on my larger printer. So we'll stick with that. Let's go back into perspective view so it looks a little better. All right. So now that we have the housing for our actual clock kit here and the face, we know we're going to use this, since we've already measured, to cut the hole that we need to attach our clock face. And since the kit comes with its own little metal arms, this would be really all you would need to make a surface that could look like a clock. But we do need a couple more things. One is we're not going to lay our clock down on the floor like this, so we're going to need a way to either stand it up or hang it from something. And just to cover all the bases, I'll do both. So let's go ahead and grab a tube. And before I do, I want to get rid of this because I don't want the work plane up here at the top anymore. So let's go ahead and grab the work plane and drop it in an empty space, and it'll put it right back down to the original blue work plane. Now I'll put my tube out there, crank up the sides because I like to do that, and we can stick it to the top here. Now, just to make this a little easier, I will make the entire thing merge together. So we're going to make this not tall enough to stick out, but tall enough to attach to this surface. And then we'll center it in the middle of the clock. So let's hold down Shift and click on one of our other clock objects. Since they're all centered, it doesn't matter which one I align it to. Click on Align and hit that middle circle. So now I have a spot that if I have a nail sticking into a wall, I should be able to hang this on there. Next, if I don't want to hang it, I'll make some feet that come from the backside here so that I could stand the whole thing up. Let's go ahead and grab a box and put it roughly where I want the foot to be. Now, like everything else, I'm going to have to drag the top down to make sure it doesn't come out of the surface. And then we want the bottom of this foot to line up with the bottom edge of the clock face so that when it sits on the ground, it won't be tilted backwards or fall over. So I'm going to hold Shift and select the clock face here. And then we're going to use the Align tool one more time. This time I'm going to align it with the bottom edge. You can see that my foot shape is going to peek out the bottom. Perfect. Now, without moving this, I'm going to select my box again. We'll make it narrower. Oops, that's a problem. Since I've messed that up, I'm going to undo it. Let's grab the black handle instead of the white one and just drag this side in. That way I know I can't move it up and down by accident. We'll make this 5 millimeters thick. And looking at it from the side, I don't want it to be floating there. So I'll zoom in and we'll grab the black handle here as well so I don't accidentally make it wider and move it in so it intersects with our soft box shape. All right, let's look at this from the top and in flat view so I can make sure they line up. We've got one foot. We'll duplicate it and use the arrow keys so it doesn't go up and down. I'll just move it over to the other side. Now let's look at it from the bottom, make sure that it's actually attached. Move it in a little bit more. And just to make sure that it's got perfect symmetry, I'm going to hold down Shift, select the other foot, and group them together. Now that they're a group, they're always going to stay the same distance apart. So I'll hold Shift and click on the clock face, and then we'll align these guys to the center of the clock face. So now they are equally distant from the center of the clock face, and it should be nice and symmetrical when we stand it up. Great. So the last thing to do is to actually put numbers on this clock. And since I want to be putting things on the clock face, I am going to use the work plane trick one more time and drop the work plane directly on the clock face. Now, if we were to be printing this standing up like this, we could put raised things up here on the clock face, but that means we would need support material all around the inside of this. It would be a huge pain to clean up. However, if I print it flipped upside down, then I have a flat surface for the whole clock face, as well as all of these are now standing up rather than being full of support. So I'll make my clock face with slightly cut in numbers, which I can use as a guideline to paint later, and they will remain flush with this so that I don't have to worry about anything sticking up out of the floor requiring supports. So in order to line up my clock, I'm going to go ahead and add a cylinder shape here. And the reason I want to do this is because I want to make some objects that are in the exact spots that I want the numbers for the clock to be. So I will create placeholder shapes that I can align the numbers to afterwards. Let's start by making this placeholder a little smaller. I'm going to hold down Shift and Alt so that it shrinks down from the center. And I want this to be directly in the center of my clock. So let's hold down Shift and select the clock face and click on Align. Make sure that it is in the center. Next, I'm going to duplicate the placeholder and I'll use the arrow keys, just move it down to the other side. And I want to make sure that they're equal distance from the center. So I'm going to click on this one, hold down Shift. And with our two shapes selected, we're going to group them so that they act as one shape. Click on our clock face and click Align. We're going to line them up to the center, up and down. Now they're going to be equal distance from the center. So let's deselect everything and click on our placeholder object here. And now I know that I need to rotate it around to get the spots for all 12 numbers on the clock. So I'm going to duplicate this and then head down here to our rotate. So I'm going to rotate this, and you can see that if we went one of these steps, 22.5 degrees, we're going to end up with 16. So it's not a 12th. So that means that we're going to need to go to 30 degrees. And if it's hard to get this to line up to exactly the right degree, because if you move the mouse just slightly, it'll go one off, you can always click on the measurement, just like you can change the measurements for length, and you can type in the number of degrees. But now that I've got this at 30 degrees, if I click duplicate and repeat, I'm going to go 30 degrees each time, and that should give us 12 individual spaces all the way around. And now we know that they are exactly in this position. So I'm going to need to ungroup these shapes so that I can line things up to them. As you can see, the group center is the center of the clock. And I don't want to line anything up to the center of the clock. I want to line them up to the center of my placeholders. So I'm going to move the view all the way over. I'm going to lift these guys tall so that from the side, I could very easily drag a box that just touches the top of all of my placeholders. Now I will change their color, and actually let's make them transparent. And then we're going to ungroup our entire set here. Oops. I should have done the color after that, since I changed the color of the group, and that disappeared once I ungrouped it. So I'm going to go back here, we'll do transparent, and it will give it a different color. So now the last thing that I want to do is lock them in place so that I can't move them by accident. So now I have 12 locked shapes. I can select them, but I can't move them or change their size until I unlock them. So let's get our numbers out. And we're going to keep the work plane where it is because I want everything to be lined up to the top of our clock face. So I'm going to click on basic shapes here, and we're going to go down to text and numbers. I could create text fields and type numbers into them individually, but I think I will use the pre-existing numbers here. So I'm going to go down and go to the next page. And we've got our digits 0 through 9. So start by dragging out 1 and a 2 for 12 here. And we will select the 2 of these, use the Align tool to line them up. And then I think I'll just nudge this over so it's very close together. We get our other 2-digit shapes, but I'm going to group these together. And let's do the same thing. Let's make an 11 and a 10, excuse me. And here we go. That's centered. Let's move them close and group them together. Take the 2 of those, center them, make sure they're just 1 millimeter apart, and group them together. All right. Now we'll see if we like the size of these shapes. So my 2-digit numbers are the biggest. They take up a lot of space, but they are not going to overlap. So this looks good. So if I take my 12 and hold down Shift and select my placeholder shape there, I can go ahead and use the Align tool to line the 12 up exactly to the middle. So let's do the same thing for the 11 on its placeholder. And for the 10. I'm going to click on the placeholder object so the Align tool lines up with the center of the placeholder and not with the center of our numbers. Let's double check that this is correct on my 12. So I don't think I did that right. Click on that. You can see that the handles move to a different position. There we go. Now these are all centered. We're going to use the same trick to do the rest of our single-digit numbers. So I'll grab 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. All right. Here we go. Line up. Select one, hold down Shift, select the next one, click Align, click on the object I want to line it up to, and click my centers. You can also just hit L on the keyboard to open up the Align tool, and then you don't have to move over there and click each time. So 1, Shift, 2, L, click on placeholder, line it up, L, placeholder, line it up. L, placeholder, line it up. L, placeholder, line it up. All right. So now that our letters are in place, our numbers, let's take a look from the side. Looks like I accidentally lined it up with the top on the 12 there, which I don't want to do. But I can click on the 12 and just hit D for drop and drop it back onto the surface since my work plane is right here on the top there. So let's get rid of our placeholder objects by looking at everything straight from the side, and then we'll drag a box that just touches the top of our cylinders. Now I can unlock them, and I can move them away, but I'm just going to delete them since I don't need them anymore. Oops, looks like I missed some. Unlock and delete. And now we're going to need to cut our numbers out of our clock face, just deep enough that we can see them. So let's look from the side once more, and let's draw a box around these guys to grab all of them. You can see that I have also captured this, so I'm going to hold down Shift and click on that and remove it from my selection. And now we're going to take our up and down handle here, and we're just going to move it down 1 millimeter. Change all of these guys into holes. And now we're ready to cut the numbers out of our clock face, as well as cut the hole for the stem of our clock hands. So let's click outside of our objects and drag around to select everything at once and group it together. So we have so many shapes, it'll take it a little bit of time. And let's do a final check around our shape to make sure that it's going to work. Awesome. Now you should be able to print this by flipping it upside down. While the numbers here are 1 millimeter in, the actual shapes inside of them are small enough that you should be able to bridge these gaps, so we can print this without any supports. If we print it with supports, the letter or the numbers themselves are going to be filled in, and they'll have to dig the supports out after you flip it over. So let's take our object here, and we don't want to use the mirror tool or we'll switch the direction of our numbers. Let's grab the rotate tool and rotate it 180 degrees. And just to stop this from being confusing, we can drop the work plane on there. And now we have a shape that should lie flush with the ground and be ready to print without supports. And lastly, you can take and create your own set of handles or hands for your clock. A kit like this will come with hands of its own, but they might not be the exact right size for your clock face. So using whatever measurements you like to make these guys fit your clock face, the only important part of our hands here is that we both want our shapes, and I will ungroup these so you can see how I made these, to be a couple of millimeters thick. 1 millimeter is very thin and can be pretty flexible. It might work, but I like to go up to 2 millimeters just to make something sturdy. The most important measurements for this are, of course, the holes, as they have to match the actual rings that come out of the stem for your clock. So the outer or widest part of the plastic on the clock face there is going to be the hour hand. And so on mine, I have measured a 5 millimeter outer ring. Above it will be another bit of plastic. It's very slightly smaller than the other, and this is going to be the minute hand. So I've made a longer hand, and this is simply a stretched out version of the polygon. So using a hexagon shape and stretching it out so that I've got a point at each end. You can use something simple like that or get more elaborate. And the last one is a little bit more complicated. Our second hand here, in the center of the plastic tubes that we are going to fit our two other arms to, is a tiny metal pin. Now, if you have a kit, you'll see the second hand itself has a metal pin on it with a hole in the center that will fit right over that pin in the center of your clock. And so it needs to be, this cylinder needs to be small enough to fit inside and have a hole in it that is very tiny. Luckily, tiny holes are easier to print than very tiny shapes. So I have here a 2mm tube, which from my measurements should fit inside of the hole for the minute hand. And in that, I have a 1mm tube, a 1mm hole that should be small enough to grip onto the pin in the center of the clock. This part of the design might take some testing and some fiddling with. You may have to print hands for your clock multiple times if the measurements aren't quite right. When you get into very small things, there can be a slight expansion of the plastic. So the 2mm tube is actually going to be 2.1 or 2.025, and it might be just enough to get it stuck so that it won't turn. So you might find that you'll have to change the size by less than a millimeter, which you can do by typing it in or by changing your snap grid down to things like 0.1 millimeter. You can grab your shapes and change the size by 1/10 of a millimeter at a time. But this is the part that requires experimentation. So we're going to print our clock arms lying face down along the clock face. And hopefully print them out of a contrasting plastic so that they can be easily seen, or we'll have to color them in some other way. So next time we're going to set up this design for print. Should be very straightforward. After all that work designing it, it won't require any supports. We're going to prepare our clock kit for slicing. We have our newly designed hands for the clock and the face and body itself. You might not need to print these if you're going to use the hands that came with the kit itself, but I'm going to arrange them so that they are closer to the face so that we can export them all as one piece. So let's put our clock hands close by, but make sure that they are not overlapping anything. Now I'm not terribly concerned with how far away they are because I know that my size here, 127 by 126, will easily fit on my printer. But I don't want them to be as far away as possible because that just means more travel for the print head during each layer that they try to print. You can also print these as separate individual prints, meaning that it'll take a little bit longer, but if you have a failure, you won't lose all of the parts at once. So now let's export this, and we'll take only the selected shapes and create a single STL file from them. Now that we've got our clock kit STL, we'll go into Cura and click on Open. So let's grab the kit, and we can see that all the parts have come into the printer bed, and if we try to move them, they'll all move as one piece because they're considered a single object since they're from one single STL. Now I've got my correct printer and material selected already, and we're going to take a look at the settings that we need to make sure that this prints without filling our numbers with support. So if we look at this from below, all of the downward faces that are touching the floor are now highlighted in blue, and all of the downward faces that are not touching the floor are highlighted in red. You can see that if I move this up, all of these faces would be red. Let's make sure that we have this dropped on the floor again by centering the selected model. There it is. And now what we want to do is print support underneath our feet here, because we want them to be raised up a little bit, but not underneath all of these numbers. Numbers are cut into the surface only 1 millimeter, and so 1 millimeter of support material to peel out of each of these numbers is just going to make things difficult. So in order to stop it from printing support, we're going down here to create a blocker. And if I click anywhere on my model, it's going to create this box. And this box is just an area that changes how the slicer behaves. So the box will not be printed, but we can go into scale here, and let's click on the box, scale the whole thing up, and let's make sure, going straight from below, that we are covering up all of the numbers. It's not quite centered, so I'll move it over here, and I can see, I can even shrink it a little bit, that it is going to cover up all of the red faces on the numbers. And it doesn't matter how tall this shape is, because it is only blocking where we want to put supports. And we can make sure that our feet are sticking out of our block here. There's a tiny corner of them that's covered up, but that's not important. We still will have enough area here to support the foot. So now that our support block is in place, let's double check our settings. If you don't see all of these, you'll be on the simplified recommended settings. You can go to custom and take a look at all of these things. Now we can go down to a thicker layer height, or a lower quality as it might be called, because we don't have any smooth curves that we need to look good. We only have straight up and down walls, and so the thickness of each layer going up doesn't really change much about how the actual final print looks. So we can print it faster with a lower quality or a thicker layer height. Now we do want to generate supports because we have these feet to support, and we can go ahead and tell it to generate supports everywhere because it will still ignore everything that is inside of the block. We'll double check build plate adhesion. Because our entire front here is on the floor, we definitely want this to be skirt and not brim or raft, which is going to attach some things to our front face, which we'll have to cut off later, and we don't want to do that. So skirt it is, and now we're ready to slice. We've got almost 5 hours of printing ahead of us, and if we take a look at the preview, we can scroll down and see that our walls are going to be printed with our default 20% infill here, so that they will be mostly hollow. And once we get down to the bottom of the foot here, we can see that there will be a little bit of support holding up the end of this shape. Gets printed on top of it, keeping it from sagging down before we get to the rest of the layers. If we go down further, you can see that the front of the clock face is going to be printed with spaces for the numbers. And once we get up to 1 millimeter here, we're going to cover them with solid lines. So this diagonal movement is going to bridge this gap. And because it's a fairly small gap, it shouldn't sag too much. And we're not worried about that since we're going to be filling this area in with paint or something else later to make the numbers stand out. So now that we're sure our slices work, we can save it to file, and we've got G-code that we can upload, and we're ready to print.